St. Jack was a book by Paul Theroux, who wrote a book called The Great Railway Bazaar, which was one of Orson Welles' favorite books. And he was the first one to mention St. Jack to me. He thought it'd make an interesting movie. The rights to it were owned by Playboy, and which was amusing because Sybil Shepherd and I, we were living together at the time, were in the midst of a lawsuit against Playboy for something that had happened on a picture a few years before. Anyway, make a long story short, we ended up settling the lawsuit by getting the rights to St. Jack. And Sybil's company and Playboy Enterprises and Roger Corman produced the picture together, although Roger put up all the money and all the resources to make the picture. But Sybil Shepherd actually wrote the first draft of a screenplay, which then Paul Theroux rewrote, and then Howard Sackler, the Pulitzer Prize-winning playwright, came in and did yet another draft, which is pretty much the one we used. He was the one who had the idea to break the story into 3 acts by having the Denham Elliott character come back to Singapore 3 times, as opposed to coming once as he does in the book. And that gave us a structure. But we found that when we got to Singapore, I say we, Ben Gazzara, and who was going to star in it, and George Morfogen, who was my old friend and producing partner on the picture, we found that here was a book about a pimp and hookers, but there wasn't much about hookers in the book, and there wasn't much really in the script about them. So we found out quite a lot about that world in Singapore once we got there, and all that was folded into the script later. Also, we weren't allowed to make the movie in Singapore. Singapore had banned the book because they didn't like the idea that Singapore was, in fact, a kind of R&R station for the American soldiers during the Vietnam War. They would be brought to Singapore, among other places, and they'd have some R&R with recruited women, and then they'd be sent back to Vietnam. Singapore didn't like that as a heritage, and so they did everything they could to keep that out of the news, and they banned St. Jack. So when we came to shoot a picture there, we couldn't exactly say we were shooting St. Jack. They didn't want the book around. They certainly didn't want us. So we told them we were making a picture called Jack of Hearts, not about a pimp, but rather about a fella who wants to start a nightclub. And I actually wrote an entire treatment called Jack of Hearts, which was about 30 pages, which was a whole story. And that was what we gave everybody, and that isn't, we never had any intention of shooting it. It was a kind of a cross between Pal Joey and Love is a Many Splendid Thing. Anyway, that's what everybody thought we were shooting until sometime after we left Singapore. And when they found out what we really were shooting, they were not happy. And in fact, I've never been back to Singapore, which I regret because it was a fascinating country. Overall, we spent 6 months there making this picture. And it was quite a life-altering experience. It's a movie about hypocrisy, about values, about America's involvement in Vietnam, about politics. And it's a movie we tried very much to avoid the cliche. We tried to avoid what would normally be done in a movie like this. And so we went the opposite way, which got us a lot of good reviews and great praise in Europe. The picture won the Critics' Prize in Venice, an award that hadn't been given for 7 years, not since A Clockwork Orange had received it. So we were in good company, and the picture was a kind of a sensation in Europe and passed by without too much notice in America, although it got some wonderful reviews. Well, I think the picture has certainly was influenced by Orson Welles in certain areas. First of all, he's the one who first suggested that I even read it. There was talk of his working on the picture as a director at one point, but it didn't work out. I can't say that I, spent the picture thinking about him. This was my, I don't know what picture it was, but it was not my first. It was one of my, I'd already done a few pictures by then. I'd had some successes, some failures, and one of the interesting things, it is a pivotal movie, however, in my career, in that I had 3 very successful films and 3 unsuccessful films. Of the 3 unsuccessful films that followed the successful films, 2 of them came out really not at all what I had wanted, and since they'd been pet projects, it was painful, and they'd been expensive failures, and I sort of stopped working for about 3 years and said, okay, something went wrong, because these were projects I really cared about. I really wanted them to be good, and they came out compromised, and they weren't box office, and they weren't even what I wanted. So something's gone wrong, and I consciously said, let's not make any pictures till we figure it out. And one of the things I figured out is I wanted to get as far away from California, as far away from Hollywood filmmaking as possible, and Singapore was about as far away as you can get. There was never a film made there. There was no studio. There was no history of filmmaking in Singapore, so that was getting pretty far away from from Hollywood. And the other thing is I wanted to make a movie getting back to the roots, getting back to the way I'd first made pictures with Roger Corman. My first film, Targets, which he produced, was made for $130,000. We had, no money, no time, 23 days. But it was a good picture, and it was you work hard that way. St. Jack wasn't that economically done. We shot it in about 55 or 60 days, but we made it inexpensive. We had no big crew. It was 10 or 12 people on the crew. As I said, we didn't have many big names. A lot of the actors were not actors. So it was getting back to trying to do something with an enormous amount of quality, something about, a movie about something which had a political and moral resonance, but didn't cost a lot of money. Was made for as little as we could make it and make the picture we wanted to make. And that's what we did. I can't look back on it and say, gee, I wish I'd had a few more bucks, I wish I had a few more days. No, we did the picture we wanted to do. It's one of the few pictures of mine that I wouldn't touch. It may not be good, but it's what I wanted to make. And that was, again, that was learning from Roger, learning from John Cassavetes, and learning from Orson Welles, 3 filmmakers who have always pushed for their own vision, doing it their own way. And so this was a big change, going back to basics. Basically, was what this film was, going back to basics, trying to do a film for a reasonable price that really had something to say. Well, I've tried not to be too self-conscious, so I don't like to analyze myself or talk about my style or any of that kind of thing. I don't like to do that. Only thing I can say is that this film, I think, represents, is a good example of the way I like to make films at the best. By that I mean shooting on real locations, using good actors, but also using some non-professionals. There's a lot of cross-cutting where there needs to be, but a lot of the scenes are played in one shot. And some of the best acting scenes are played in long takes. I like that too. In fact, I think when we did a breakdown, we found that there were less setups on St. Jack than any picture I ever did. I believe in an economy of gesture. I believe if you can make a shot do 2 or 3 things, it's better than if it just does one thing. I think if a scene can kill 2 or 3 birds with one stone, it's better than if it just is there for one reason. One of the things this picture tried to avoid, as I say, is the cliches of movie making. Well, these guys tattooed him with all sorts of obscene words, so he's going to have to beat the hell out of these guys. He doesn't. He barely he has a moment where he could have a revenge, but it's more normal. It's just like, what are you going to do, beat somebody up in the middle of the street? He's not Clint Eastwood. He's not a movie hero. We tried to show a regular guy in a terrible situation, a guy who maybe pushes the envelope in certain areas, a guy whose morality is in question, but who ultimately has to make a decision that that has to do with morality on a very high level, and he makes a decision that people in very high office, political office, would maybe not have made. And so that's what the movie's about, really. Morality, right and wrong. And it throws that into a number of, it's ambiguous, the answers. I think it's one of the best pictures I've made. I like it. I think it holds up well. It's a movie in which we consciously not only tried but strove valiantly to avoid cliches, to avoid doing it conventionally. I remember when Elaine May first saw it, she said, gee, I mean, you really didn't tell us anything, did you? I mean, you think you could put a little exposition in there? Because we had really left out a lot of even expositionary things, and we ended up putting them in later just to help the audience follow what was going on. But we found that a lot of people like this movie. It's a kind of cult film. It never got a huge audience, but it has very fervent admirers, and I think it holds up pretty well.
Looking cigar, Cuban? Yeah. Indonesian, made of paper.
Well, I think that movies are, like any art, is a kind of a, you could say it's a little bit like a relay race. You know, you run with the piece of wood for a certain amount of time, then you have to pass along. I think that I was very fortunate that men like Orson Welles and John Ford and Howard Hawks and Alfred Hitchcock and Jean Renoir were very generous with their time with me, and I studied their work and learned a lot from their work, and also learned an enormous amount from them. And now there are, people who say they've learned something from my pictures, and that's good. That's a kind of a relay race. We pass along what we know from one generation to the other, and that's hopefully makes everything stronger. St. Jack is a picture that I would say was influenced by Orson Welles, certainly, and certainly by John Cassavetes, and by Jean Renoir. But I think it was a picture that I wasn't trying to do an homage to anybody. The picture owes a great deal, in fact, to the Roger Corman Guerrilla School of Filmmaking, of which I'm a proud graduate. The picture was made on the run. We did it with virtually almost no professional actors, with the exception of the few English actors and one American actor that happened to be nearby Singapore, George Lazenby, and the English actors. Those are everybody else in the movie besides Gazzara, myself, the English actors, and George Lazenby are all non-professionals. They never acted before. We had no sound stages. Everything was shot on real locations, real buildings. Some were buildings that had fallen into disuse, and we redressed them, and soon they were torn down. Everything that you see in the picture, all the locations, with the exception of the obvious high-rise hotel scenes, all the sort of Chinese, all the Asian atmosphere, all that's gone. All those locations, everywhere we shot, has been torn down to make way for progress.
Okay, pal. What are you, Italian? Your name's Schumann. Eddie Schumann.
I think St. Jack has been one of the most rewarding experiences in terms of filmmaking that I've ever had. And I wasn't going to act in it originally. We tried to get Charles Grodin to play the part, and we talked to a couple of other actors, and then Ben Gazzara said, "Why don't you play it?" And so I thought, all right, I'll play it. And it was fun to play the part because luckily I had George Morfogen off camera who could tell me if I was doing something wrong. And if Benny Gazzara wasn't in the scene, he kept an eye on me too. He gave me some nice beats of direction. So that was fun. And this was, as I say, it was a difficult picture, but it was a kind of a life-altering experience. A lot of things happened, and none of us who were there for 6 months were the same after we left. A lot of pictures aren't fun, but this one was. Hard work, but very, very illuminating. Roger and I first met shortly after I came to California in 1965, and we met at a screening of a French movie. Somebody there knew me and knew Roger, and Roger was there, and we were introduced, and he had read some of my stuff in Esquire magazine. I was a feature writer for Esquire, and he said, "You're a writer, I've seen your byline in Esquire." And I said, "That's right. Would you like to write a screenplay?" Yeah. And so he hired me to write a screenplay. He found out that I'd already been directing in the theater and had acted in the theater, and so he was starting a picture, and I hadn't yet finished the script I'd started to write for him when he asked me if I would be his assistant on a film that was then called All the Fallen Angels and became known as The Wild Angels with Peter Fonda. Well, I started to work on the picture as his assistant, which meant finding some locations, and then he asked me to rewrite the screenplay, which I did, and so I did about 80% rewrite of the screenplay without credit. That was part of the deal, and then worked for, supposed to be 6 weeks, but I ended up working 22 weeks on The Wild Angels and received the greatest on-the-job training course you could ever get, because I not only was his assistant and next to him throughout the whole thing, throughout the casting process and all the shooting that he did, but then I ended up rewriting the script, as I said, but also being his assistant during his 3 weeks of shooting, and then ending up directing the second unit on the picture for 3 weeks, where I actually was directing the second unit, but it was the first unit, and I directed some of the leading actors, and then the second week we had a little less people, and last week was a real Roger Corman, 3-man shoot. But I did, and then Roger said, "Well, edit your own stuff together because we haven't got time." So I learned how to edit as well. So by the time I'd finished The Wild Angels, I'd really gotten a full course from a master in how to make pictures. And then that picture turned out well. He was very happy with The Wild Angels, the way it turned out. So he asked me if I would like to make my own movie, and gave me I said yes, and he gave me the opportunity he said, "Well, Boris Karloff owes me 2 days' work." And that's how a movie called Targets began. And that became my first feature. And Roger produced that, and we sold it to Paramount and made a profit. And that was the beginning of my career. It launched my career. Targets did. And I signed a 7-picture deal, and pretty soon I made the last picture show, and so on. So I went through 3 very big successes, 1 success to seem, 2 flops, and then I was here with Roger again, trying to get back to basics. And again, he came through, produced this picture. He came down to Singapore for a few days before we started, saw that we were in pretty good shape, and never bothered us again. We made the picture, and that's it. We're still good friends. I admire him, respect him enormously, and we've been friends for 35 years. And he's meant a great deal to me. He started me out, and I learned invaluable lessons from him. He's been a friend and a mentor for many years.